We are lucky here tonight to be joined by our second GM on the podcast.
Former
We're gonna be
GM, I
talking,
guess.
well, former GM, yes. We're not so lucky to be talking with active GMs, but former Mets GM Steve Phillips will be joining us today to discuss the New York Mets and a lot about the New York Mets, but also just about being a GM in baseball, about the struggles, trying to manage what it is like managing a team, and a little bit of what it might be like being a professional, somebody involved in professional baseball and having to watch your son play high school sports. This week on Almost Cooperstown.
We've been looking forward to this for a very long time. So he's the host of the Leadoff Spot on Sirius Radio, a show I listen to almost every day. And Steve Phillips does a lot of different things in a lot of different places. He's omnipresent, and we're lucky that he's going to join us on the podcast today. Just want to add that he actually was drafted by the New York Mets, and so there will be a lot of Met talk today because Steve is also the former GM of the Mets, and we'll get into that as well. So, Steve, welcome to the podcast. Gordon and I are happy to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me on. Happy to talk baseball with baseball fans, especially local guys as well. So, and friends from back in the day. So happy to do it.
Yes,
well, thank you. And it is very exciting for us because, we were able to talk with Dan Evans previously, but I mean, you were the GM of the team we were watching that we were all following. So it was just super interesting for us to have this chance to talk just because I think baseball fans, we all like to talk about the GMs and what they can't do to influence the direction of a team. But I think it's always so interesting that we're so willing to give them both all of the credit when it works out and all of the blame when it doesn't work out, even though I don't think they're nearly as responsible for either end of that spectrum as we, the fans, like to act like they are.
Yeah, I think that so much, you make moves, you think you're doing the right thing, you put a team together, and you could make every right decision and things can go wrong. And it doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. It means it just didn't work. And you bring in talent, you bring in players. Like I traded for Robbie Alomar back in the day. The season before I got him, he hit 300, hit 20 homers, stole 20 bases, scored 100 runs, drove in 100 runs. And when we got him, it was like he forgot how to play. It's like he left his game back in Cleveland. And like, who would have known that? And, some part, being in New York, not everybody can handle the New York market, the media, the fans, etc. But sometimes you can make the right decisions and things still don't work out.
And Robbie Alomar, look, we were all in favor of that when it happened for the reasons you described. And the man is in the Hall of Fame. So, it's not like it wasn't like, well, let's try that. Let's have a Hall of Famer play second base for the team for a while. So you can understand what the attraction was.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was still an all-star caliber player. It's just, I think for him more than other things, New York didn't go well. We got off to a slow start that year, and he got off to a slow start. And how Mets fans and New York fans communicate by booing. They don't do that in Cleveland. They don't do that in Baltimore. They don't do that in Toronto. And I don't know. I don't think he knew how to handle that. He was going through some personal stuff at the time, too, that I think played into it some. But we had a collection of players that year where, we sort of won the off season, but we didn't win in season because of it. And it didn't have the exit strategy in place to maybe undo some of the things we have put in place.
I think you raised an interesting point there, kind of talking about the New York, both sports media and the sport fan environment. And I think as somebody that's literally part of that, as part of the fan environment, I think we lack the ability to have our own perspective on like how overbearing that can be. Like we always hear about how playing in New York is a unique challenge, but how much of it is a unique challenge compared to it playing like in the Los Angeles market or in the Chicago market?
Well, I think the booing thing, like for instance, can you imagine like if you lose money with your stockbroker going into his office and going, boo, you suck. Or, you have a meal in a restaurant that you don't like that much and you start booing. Like nobody does that, but yet we do that in sports. And I'll never forget, we were in St. Louis for the playoffs. I want to say it was in 2000. And back then they didn't have a suite for us, the visiting team. So we sat down behind home plate and seats among the fans. And, St. Louis is such a nice place. People are so kind. But down the left field line, people started chanting, New York sucks, New York sucks. And a fan, a gentleman sitting a couple rows in front of us who knew we were the Mets front office, got up between innings, came over and said, listen, I want to apologize for our fans. that's not generally how we communicate and everything else. And I was like, don't worry about it. Our own fans say that about us too, so not a big deal. And it really is. It's just a different way of communicating. And I know that when fans do it, they think in their mind somehow there's going to be some motivation for the player. But in a game where you fail 7 out of 10 times, trying harder is the worst thing that you can do. Like when guys aren't hitting or they're not throwing the right pitch, it's not lack of effort. It's lack of, at times it could be lack of concentration. It could be just lack of execution. And when you try harder, you then think to yourself as a hitter, like I did it for 7 years in the minor leagues. I was a trier. I tried too hard. And what happened was it compounds the problem. You become over aggressive. You chase pitches out of the zone. And all it does is make it worse, where the best way to get performance out of players is with sugar. Tell them you love them. Players, they can fool themselves, but when they start getting booed, none of them know how to handle it.
I mean, look at last year in Philadelphia with Trey Turner. They were giving it to him for so long for that year. Then they're just like, okay, booing him relentlessly as it worked. Maybe we should try, like at least acknowledging the fact the guy's out there and giving it his all. And then he turned it around and was unbelievable.
Honestly, it's a case study. I think that like if fans really could understand that if you want better performance, cheering players and telling them that you have their back and you believe in them is the reality. It will get a better performance. And Trey Turner got hot after that happened, right? It took the burden of pressure off because he was trying so hard to please everybody. And it's really a difficult way to play the game.
That's not the way it was. Now, would you say that Armando Benitez suffered from that as well when he was closing for the Mets around that time? It just seemed like he heard the boos and felt the boos more than other players.
It's so funny because, and again, what would happen is we'd have the lead in the 9th inning. The door would open to the bullpen. He'd come out and they'd start booing. And I'm like, you understand, it doesn't just impact him. The other 8 players on the field feel that energy too. Like it doesn't lift anybody up. And it was funny because, he saved 45 out of 48 games one year and everybody wanted me to get a new closer. And I'm like, who am I going to get that's going to be better than 45 out of 48? Like they don't really make, and I got to tell you, like he was a warrior. He never said no about coming into the game. And when he was supposed to have a day off, Bobby Valentine would run down to the bullpen and say, listen, can you get me a hitter? Can you get me an inning? Yeah, Poppy, I can get you. He never said no. He always made himself available. So his teammates appreciated him. But I don't know that anybody else really did.
And if Timo Perez runs out that ball, it maybe doesn't matter that Benitez has to save that game one or not, by the way.
Yeah. I look at it and think to myself, for Timo, it wasn't lack of hustle, it was bad judgment. Because if he had known that it wasn't a home run, he would have kept running. But, when you don't know for sure, then you've got to keep running. And I look back too and think, I wonder what would happen if, we win game 1 of that series. How different could it be? Because for a 5-game series, it was sure a much closer series than 5 games might indicate back in the 2000 World Series against the Yankees.
I was sitting in right field in Game 5 when I think it was Paul O'Neill caught that ball at the end of the game, and to watch the Yankees go nuts on the field was a very sobering moment for a fan. I'd never had that experience, to do that, and it really gets you in touch with your team because I think if they had won, I might not remember it as much as they had lost, at least in that moment.
Yeah, I tell you, my view is always I always wanted to clinch on the road, so I would mess up somebody else's clubhouse and not our clubhouse, So I think the Yankees probably preferred that too. But yeah, that was a tough one. I remember after we lost that Game 5, I went down to the umpires' room, thanked them for their efforts in the series, and I went over to find George Steinbrenner and Brian Cashman. Now at the time, they told me George Steinbrenner's out on the field celebrating with the fans, so I actually walked out onto the Shea Stadium field looking for George Steinbrenner amidst Yankee fans. That didn't really work out all that well for me because they weren't, like most fans, they weren't the most gracious winners, I might say. Because look, when it's New York, it's for bragging rights, and there's somewhat put it in your face anyways. So yeah, that was probably not my best move, was going down looking for him on the field, but I wanted to congratulate him. I thought it was the right thing to do when you're taking on another team in a World Series.
And certainly that was the Yankee fans at sort of their height, at least in the modern era of their evil empire. They were fresh off their unbelievable 90s, not realizing that, oh, that's only going to be their only World Series title for a while, and really all that they've gotten since then. So it's got to, like, you were dealing with them probably at their worst in a long period of time there.
You know, it was the last back-to-back World Series champions that we've had, right? So we haven't had it in that long a period of time. And so it has been a bit of a drought for them, although 2009, I guess it was, right? They did win. And, now they're in a bit of a drought again. But, I look at it and think if people were realistic, with 30 teams, your team should reasonably win once out of every 30 years, right? That would be the fair distribution of championships. The notion that it's a failed season if you don't win a World Series every year, there is a certain level of arrogance to that. Now, it's not just them. I think Dodgers fans now look at it that way, that if we don't win a World Series, then it's a disappointing season. But I think that, winning a championship has become that much more difficult now because of all of the rounds that we have in the playoffs. And the pathway to get there is much different than it used to be. Back in the day, you'd win your division, you'd play the other division, you'd go to a World Series. Or you'd win the National League and you'd go to a World Series and you'd have one round, you'd have a playoffs. And so it's changed so much. And the rigors of trying to win 11 games is not easy in the postseason. You think about the regular season, how up and down and where the worst team can beat the best team in a series. And we don't even think that much about it during the course of a regular season. But, when the lesser team wins in the playoffs, I mean, why not? I mean, it's just, this is baseball. And the shorter the series, the more great individual performances can rule the day. And it's not necessarily the best roster that wins. It's the team that plays the best, not the best team.
I mean, you look at the 3-game wild card rounds. If you're maybe perceived as the weaker team, but you have an amazing ace on your staff and you're able to win that first game off of an unbelievable pitching performance, when you kind of step back and go, okay, we just have to find a way to win one of two baseball games. A lot can happen in any one game where you set yourself up in a way to win a series that you might be on paper not nearly as good as the other team, but you got a great performance from one guy, and then you just have to find a way to win another game.
Yeah, there's so much pressure. Plus, all 3 games are played in one stadium, and there's so much pressure on that team. And the road team just kind of comes in. And the other thing, in the wild card round, particularly when the wild card team plays the third division winner, many of the wild card teams have been playing playoff baseball for the entire month of September just to get to the playoffs, where division winners, they clinched, and I think the Brewers, right? They clinched for a period of time. They didn't have to really worry that much about it. They won their division by 10 games. And they didn't really play playoff baseball, and yet the Mets come in with sharp teeth, ready to go this past year, and playing their best baseball after the weekend series with Atlanta. They were all fired up and had that momentum going, and it has become more and more momentum matters in the playoffs more than rosters matter in the playoffs.
And you think that's sort of what we're going to be seeing here with looking at GMs, and that the GM is just trying to build a roster to get to the playoffs, because winning the postseason might just be getting hot in the right year, which means you want to maximize your chances by just getting there as often as possible. And then with as many games as you're
right. So it's interesting. I think so I think of the Yankees, I think of the Dodgers, and I think they're trying to build a roster to win in the playoffs. With the deepest starting pitching they can get and trying to maximize the starting pitching matchups in a short series. But I think that because we've seen wildcard teams have such success, and in 23 we had 2 wildcard teams in the World Series, I think that for owners in the game, they're more inclined to invest now because they've seen wildcard teams win. And so they don't have to go all in to win the division and think, okay, well, we've got to beat the Dodgers to make a run. We've got to beat the Yankees to make a run, and they've got $300 million payrolls. But if we get in, like Cleveland did, they can make a run. And Cleveland, came close to beating the Yankees and moving on. And so I think that what it's done is, I think some of those teams that are on the bubble decide to go for it instead of rebuilding now. I think there's more an inclination to, let's see if we can invest and see if we can compete right now just to get in. Because once we do, it's a crapshoot. Now, It's not really a crapshoot. I'll still take the team with the better roster. I'll still take the team with the home field advantage. Yet, those teams that have a bye in the first round have had some difficulty in that division series because the wild card teams played playoff baseball to get there, played playoff baseball in a 3-game series, and they're kind of sharp and ready to go. And that energy is just different to start to pick up playoff energy when you've been sitting for 5 days or a week.
Do you think?
Oh, sorry. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, do you think you mentioned the Dodgers and the Yankees, and what the Dodgers did this year, remarkably sort of patching together the starting pitching so that by the time they got to the World Series, they really only had one starting pitcher in Yamamoto, who you would have thought would have been a starting pitcher on the team in the World Series. And do you think somebody like David Stearns of the Mets is looking at that going, I don't really have a number one pitcher on my staff right now. Do I need to go out and buy that? Or can we do what the Dodgers did? Because we always emulate what we see the teams doing when things are going well.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You know, the Dodgers spent $326 million on Yamamoto, $140 million on Glasnow. So they fully intended to have legitimate starters to be able to do it. They just scored enough to be able to protect their starting pitching a bit, to be able to get to the bullpen and hold the lead because their offense was so good that they just had such depth and power in that lineup. It's not the most ideal way to do it. Now, there are ways to build a team to get to the playoffs, which is, you don't need necessarily, like I did it with the Mets. I didn't necessarily have an ace, but I had a collection of number 2 to number 3 starters. So, Al Leiter and Mike Hampton and Rick Reed and Bobby Jones were all sort of the same guy that always gave us a chance to win, but we weren't necessarily going to shut somebody out. So we were going to have to score, we were going to have to defend, and we always needed to have a good bullpen, but we did. And so I think that, what David Stearns is, I think, has a reluctance to invest long-term in starting pitching. And it's the one thing that he's brought with him from the mindset of Milwaukee. I always look at like Andrew Friedman in Los Angeles and David Stearns in New York as money ball with money, right? So you can still look for values, which is what Moneyball is about, but you also have the ability to buy stars because stars win. Superstars can carry a team when everybody else is struggling. And it'll be interesting to see what David Stearns does with the pitching moving forward in New York because he does seem to be reluctant. Like they're not in on Corbin Burns, it doesn't seem. I would be. They weren't in necessarily on, there was talk that they were on Max Fried. There was talk they were in on Blake Snell, but I don't know how serious they were because Snell was 5 years. Now he wanted to play in Los Angeles, but Fried, they weren't going to go 8 years on it where the Yankees did. Now the Yankees did it. And because I thought Fried would get 6 years, the Yankees gave him 8 because it was, we lost on Soto. We can't lose now. So we're going to go spend more for this guy to lock him in. We're going to go run prevention. Now we'll start to put the offense together a little bit. But desperate people do desperate things. But I've always looked at it. People say, oh, you overpaid the player. The people who say the other team overpaid the player are the team that didn't get the player. Right. And so, what's the right price? It's whatever the market says the price is. And just because one team's willing to spend that, that's the value of that player. Now, in large markets, and to be a winning championship team, the price of participation at times is overpaying somebody, knowing that you're overpaying them, but it's the cost of doing business. And that's what they did with Soto. That's what the Yankees did with Fried. And if you want to compete, you want the guy, you're going to get the guy, and you're going to have to figure out later what you're going to do when he's not really that productive. But it seems to be the price. And in Baltimore right now, they don't seem to be willing to play that game. Like they've got this young core of players, of young major leaguers, prospects coming up, ready. But this is their window. And, forever they've been the most risk-averse organization. But with new ownership, and with a general manager who came from Houston, who was there while they started to build it, you would think that they would at some point you have to take a risk to win. At some point you have to make an investment to get the guy. You trade the prospect to get the player to win now because your window is right now. It's great to be competitive for years, but if you want a championship, sometimes, in fact, almost always, you're going to have to take a risk to get that player to get you over the top.
I think it was Stearns. I could be wrong, but I remember reading something that was saying, like, if you only ever wanted to pay the fair market rate for a player, you're going to end up second on every single player that you wanted.
Every guy. I mean, I look at last year, the Toronto Blue Jays. They were in on Ohtani. They lost out on Ohtani. They were in on Bellinger. Didn't want to pay the price on Bellinger. They were in on Matt Chapman. Didn't want to pay the price on Matt Chapman. So they settled for Kevin Kiermaier in center, Isaiah Kiner-Falefa at third base. And when you settle at multiple positions, you're a much lesser team. And so, you know, it's one that at some point you've got to step up and pay the price. The Red Sox just did it to get Garrett Crochet. They were willing to swallow hard and give up a couple of their better prospects to do it, but that was the price of competing. And teams now have to decide, do we want to give up money? Do we want to give up prospect capital to go get guys and make trades? And how do we want to do it? You can build a team in any way or in a combined hybrid way, but at some point you've got to make a deal that hurts.
Valuations continue to go up for teams, right? So I think you talked about on your show the Scrooge Index, which I think I saw last week out there, which is a measure of how much salaries and team expenses are versus revenue. And the only team, I think in 2023, that had higher expenses than they did revenue was just by a little bit were the Mets. They're like at 102%. Everybody else was, they're like at 50, 60, 70% of the total take they're taking. And so there's money for them to spend on an operating basis. Forget about the fact that their franchises are going to be worth more, in 5 years than they are today. So it boggles my mind why smart people who own teams won't do that.
Yeah, sometimes. So it's interesting, right? There are some teams that look at it that they say, okay, here's your budget. We're budgeting to break even. So when I was with the Mets, that was the plan. They would give me a payroll budget that would be with the idea that we're going to break even for the year. And if we win, we make money. And if we lose, then cut your losses at the trade deadline so we don't lose that much. So that was sort of the general plan. Some teams say, spend money to make money. So let's get out in front. Yeah, we're spending more than maybe what we're projecting, but if we're spending on the right guy, we're going to win, and therefore our revenues are going to catch up and pass where we are with payroll. But are you willing to take that chance? Are you willing to get out in front a little bit? And that comes down to owners. It's not general managers. Many of these decisions are organizational decisions, which means the owner needs to sign off on them. When you're trading for a middle reliever, you can do that as a general manager. Just let your owner know what you're doing. If you're going to sign a guy to a $300 million contract, the owner's got to sign off on it, be involved in it. I prefer my owner not to be involved in the negotiation, but we're seeing agents more and more, particularly Scott Boras. He always wants the owner involved because as a general manager, I use the owner as the bad guy. So, you want $300 million. I'm like, I would do it, but my owner won't let me do it. But it allows me to stay in the negotiation without being the guy who said no to you. When the owner's in the conversation in negotiating, he doesn't have that other person that he can say, well, my wife or my husband won't let me give you the money, and they don't want to be the bad guy. And in the media, when you don't get the player to say, oh, the owner wasn't willing to pay the extra money, so they get down on the owner. They always prefer the general manager to be that guy. Now, if the owner wants to say yes to $765 million, I want my owner involved in that negotiation, though, to get the guy.
Well,
it's a big difference. Oh, sorry, I was going to say it's a big difference between the Mets of today and the Mets of 20-ish years ago.
I was going to say the same thing, Gordon. That's exactly. It's a little different.
You guys related? Are you guys related in some way there?
You said something on your program that I think one of the reasons why I reached out to you, I thought was very interesting when it came to the Mets in terms of managing up the chain as opposed to down the chain within the Met organization, and how the people that worked below you in there, once you were no longer there, basically came to you and said, oh my God, we had no idea this was going on. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what it was like at that time.
Yeah, well, I mean, what was difficult about it. Look, I had a really good separate relationship with Fred Wilpon and a really good separate relationship with Nelson Doubleday. But they each owned 50% of the team. Literally 50% of the team. And, Fred was more of, here's our projected revenues, here's your budget. Nelson was more of, go get who you want, we'll figure it out later guy. And Fred was involved more on a daily basis. Nelson was not as involved with it, but I always kept him informed with it. But, when you're in this position, you've got this organizational chart with the major league team below you, with the manager, the coaching staff, the players, the trainers, the medical team. You've got your international scouts below you, your amateur domestic scouts. You've got your player development staff, AAA managers and coaches and roving instructors and field coordinators. All those people report to you. But from my experience, as much as my time of managing all of that below me, it was managing what was going on above me, managing expectations, managing their relationship with each other, managing their individual relationship with me. And when they were sort of 50-50 owners and didn't agree on much, I had to try to be each owner's guy, each owner's general manager, and then manage the two of them. It was not an easy task. I mean, it was very difficult to be able to navigate that. One was more involved than the other, but they didn't always get along either. And so it was a complicated front office. And so, and I would deal with them directly, and then I would protect my entire staff from it, and I would then go to them and I would sort of ask questions and get information. We'd all have meetings with ownership, and so they got to know them, but it was just different. And then, even when there was the sale of the team and they bought out Nelson Doubleday, and it became Fred Wilpon and Jeff Wilpon, it was still having two owners because they both wanted to have their own individual relationships. And so it was still managing, and they didn't always have the same opinions on things either. And as you would think, you don't want everybody to have the same opinion so that you can make the best overall decision. But part of being a general manager is listening to the owner, but also hearing what he's saying. So, if they have a strong opinion about a player and they keep harping on that player, you got to hear it at some point and understand they don't really want that player here anymore. And now I have to make a decision about what to do with it. And so, where they don't pick the players, they make it clear. And then it's, where do I take a chance? Even if I know the owner may not agree with what I'm doing, if I think it's the right thing to do, is that the battle that I pick to try to be right on? Knowing that if you're wrong, and this is for every team, if you're wrong, the owner has an opinion, you go against it. You say, listen, I do think this is the right thing for the organization. And they said, all right, if that's what you think. But in their mind, they're thinking, you better be right. Because if you're not, you may not be here anymore. And that sort of self-preservation of always trying to do the right thing for the organization, even if it means to go against the owner, it's not an easy thing to do because your job security depends upon it. And so it's a really complicated relationship, and it's one that sort of security allows a general manager to make the right decisions for the right reasons. And sometimes you don't always do that when you're in that position.
Right, because you have to be dealing with you're not necessarily dealing with analysis on whether or not it was the right move. It's results-based analysis. Every piece of data that you have, our entire team way of thinking and structuring pointed this towards being the right move. But then the guy can just turn around and go, yeah, but he hit 210 for us.
Right. I mean, I remember the one year that I got Jeremy Burnitz and Mo Vaughn and Robbie Alomar and Roger Cedeno, and all these guys. Burnitz had hit 35 home runs, walked 100 times, gotten on base. Vaughn was coming off the injury, but it had a previous 30-some homer season with the Angels, and left-handed slugger at first base. Alomar had the great season, and Cedeno had come off a great year in Detroit, so we bring him in, and nobody played. Everything went wrong. Part of it was, interestingly, Burnitz hit third when he was in Milwaukee. Mo Vaughn hit third when he was with the Angels. Alomar hit third with the Guardians. Piazza hit third for us. And everybody thought they should hit third. It's like, guys, it's only the first at bat of the game that you're necessarily going to be the third hitter or the fifth hitter in the lineup. But it was a thing. And I, it was one that I didn't really even think would be an issue, but it was a bit of an issue. And, it was a challenge for Bobby Valentine to try to figure out how to navigate the needs and wants of the players and what was the right lineup to put together for the team.
Wasn't a residual from Keith Hernandez being the number 3 hitter for the Mets back in the 80s, like all Mets thing, like, well, they being the 3 hitter here, it means everything in New York. At least for the
players,
Mets.
here's the thing I've learned. Players are weird. Okay, they're just weird. And everybody's motivated by something different. One thing that means nothing to one guy means everything to another guy. And really, the job for the manager is to be a different manager for every player. Right? You can't just be one manager for the team. You've got to be a different manager for every player. And some guys need the pat on the back. Some guys need to be coddled. Some guys need the kick in the seat of the pants. Some guys you leave them alone and let them go play. Check in with them every once in a while. Everybody's a little bit different. And, they're just all quirky in that way. And it's up to you to be able to do it. It's interesting. So while I was broadcasting, one of the things I loved the most was talking to managers before games. And, you realize, man, they're all so different. Like Charlie Manuel is so much different than Tony La Russa, who's so much different than Jim Leland, who's different than Bobby Cox, who's different than Joe Torre. But, they all had their way about them. Like Joe Torre was so thoughtful and quiet, but when he spoke, it was like everybody leaned in for it, even when he talked to the media. Bobby Cox was like a loving grandfather for his team, and he was the biggest fan. His players would say, you could be 0 for 15. He's going to make you feel like he's 11 for 15. When you make a mistake, he says it was his fault for not putting you in the right position. But he also, on August 12th, when it's 100 degrees in Atlanta, and it's the 7th inning, and we're winning 8-2, he's screaming at the umpire about this pitch that he thought he missed, because what he was saying was, I don't care how big a lead we have, I don't care what the standings say, I don't care what the score is, this pitch in this inning's the most important one, and it kept his team going. With Tony La Russa, he was the guy that you had to think along with more than anybody else. Like, you knew he was going to do something to impact the game offensively and defensively for run production and run prevention more than anybody. Squeeze bunt, sacrifice bunt, pickoff plays, bunt defense, whatever it was going to be. And so as a broadcaster, you really need to anticipate what this situation, where he might go with something. And for me, Jim Leland was the most impactful, because I'd go into Jim Leland's office for the game, we're talking to him, and he would speak in statements all the time, in Lelandisms. And but then you'd go out in the clubhouse and you talk to the players, and they would speak back to you exactly the statements that Jim Leland had said in the owner's office. And you talk about the manager being heard and impacting his players when they spoke his language. It was shocking to me. And then not a shock, considering what a great manager he was, to be able to get through it. But it's, the managers are so interesting to see how they whatever they do to try to get their guys. Charlie Manuel is just this loving, sweet teddy bear kind of a guy that loves hitters. Like, he could talk hitting with you all day long, and he loved his players. But if he didn't hustle, he'll sit you on the bench. Jimmy Rollins got benched a couple times because he didn't run balls out, but it was the best thing for Jimmy Rollins because ultimately it made him one of the best leaders in baseball.
And I can only imagine how much the job of both the manager and the GM, at least in terms of relating to the players and dealing with the players, has changed in these past 20 years, because not only are the players different, but how we evaluate the players and the players' own perception of their evaluation has got to be so much higher now. The players are just as plugged into the crazy advanced stats as the fans are, so they know who's got the highest WAR on the team. They know all that crazy stuff because they're measuring that just as much.
They are, and in fact, it's interesting that you mention it, because players now sometimes won't try to steal a base if they don't think they're going to make it, because they'll get a jump and they'll stop if they were given that, because if they get caught, it's going to affect their WAR. A guy might not try, he'll backhand a ball in the hole, but he won't try to make the dramatic play because he doesn't want it to affect his WAR. And because guys are getting paid on that now. And so I think that and it's always been whatever we're going to get paid for, we're going to do. So it was home runs for a long time. Then on base percentage became part of it. And now it's exit velocity and launch angles are all part of that. And hard hit rate. Now it's bat speed, and now we've got running the bases and values that we have for that. One of the new ones that's out there now. Players are very aware of it, and organizations are much more involved in teaching than they ever were. It used to be, as a pitcher, okay, you got to slow your body down, get your arm up. Now it's your release angle is here. Your stride toward home plate is shorter than it should be. So it's not just, hey, we got to fix your delivery a little bit. It's so scientific right now. And then where organizations excel is how do you take that information and present it to a player in a way that each individual player can digest it? Because what I found when I was working in the front office was the quickest way you want to kill an idea is somebody proposes something, say to them, go ahead, write it up for me and I'll take a look at it. But nobody's going to write it up for you. Like it wasn't a skill that was their way of doing it. And so you've got to present it in, some guys could take that information in graphs and charts. Some guys can look at statistics and percentages. Other guys need images. They need pictures to be able to digest it. And I think the best organizations aren't the ones that get the best information, because everybody kind of gets access to that now. They're all sort of looking at the same thing. It's how do you get your players to hear it, digest it, and translate it into changes in their performance on the field.
And we know how crazy superstitious baseball players are. Yeah. So suggesting they change anything about their routines, like you better have a really good argument if you're telling them to change something about their batting stance, because that's how they've always done it. How can you this has gotten me to the major leagues?
To that point, you've got to wait for somebody to fail, right? Because guys can do things differently and have success, but unless they're going to hurt themselves with their delivery, like even when players come in and signing out of the minor leagues, you kind of let them get to their own point. And then when they start to fail or struggle, they're much more receptive to ideas of change, unless they're going to hurt themselves, right? And their mechanics are going to, creating a different torque on their elbow or their shoulder, they can start to do it. But superstitions, the guys that have to hit at a certain time, have to, Wade Boggs eat chicken every day. Whatever it is, they've all got something that's a superstition, and they don't always share it, but everybody's got something.
Steve, I don't want to. We could talk to you obviously for a lot longer. Don't want to forget to ask you a couple of things for Met fans about at the end of your tenure in 2003. Jose Reyes came up that year, and I don't know exactly when he came up in that season off the top of my head. But the following year, David Wright came up, and we just learned last week that David Wright's number 5 is going to be retired next July 19th before the Reds game. And I wanted to ask you about both of those players. What did you know about Wright before he got to the major leagues as a GM, and what did you think about Reyes as a player and his potential at the beginning of his career?
Yeah, so they were both top flight prospects for us. David Wright was a sandwich round pick for us. In fact, I think it was Mike Hampton, if I'm not mistaken, leaving the Mets to go to Colorado that got us the compensation pick where we chose David Wright. And so Hampton thought the school system, I think he said, was better in Colorado than in New York, so which is why he went there. Not a great move on his part. And I got to tell you,
didn't work out so good.
I offered 7 years, $105 million to Mike Hampton. And when I said it, I thought, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Like, what am I doing? Like, I can't offer him this.
And he didn't take it.
He took 8 at 120. So the Rockies gave him more. But I wanted to take it back after I said it, because once I said it, I'm like, I had immediate buyer's remorse. And so he ended up taking it elsewhere. But David Wright was, first of all, what a kid. I mean, he was just such a classy young man. And, even when he got to the major leagues, he would go back home in the off season and sleep in the bottom bunk with his brothers in the bunk beds at home with his parents. Like, he was just a guy, he was just such a really classy, smart, and just a, high integrity young man. So we knew he was going to be a very good player. And I don't know if anybody could predict that he would have been that good And it's a shame because, he's been on the Hall of Fame ballot. And if he had stayed healthy, I think he would have been a Hall of Fame player if he had stayed healthy. And so, and then for Jose Reyes, he was just this exciting, explosive player. He could fly around the bases and he loved to play the game. He had this smile on his face that you saw at the major league level. He always loved to play. He had so many injuries, though. He had so many hamstring injuries that I was worried he was going to be one of these guys that just could never stay healthy and stay on the field or maximize his ability because, speed was a big part of his game. But he finally got that under control. And obviously it turned out to be a great player. In fact, and I knew I was on my last days in 2003. I got let go in June. And I knew we were close to calling him up, but they didn't want me to be the one who called him up when they did it, which was fine. I knew I was on my way out at the time. And with the way we had played. And so I recognized what was happening. And so they called him up after. But those two guys, very proud of their Mets careers, proud to have been, part of bringing them into the organization when we did. I know Jose had some issues in Colorado at a time, but, as a Met, he always represented the organization well. And so, look, I think that those two guys certainly part of the history and tradition and some of the numbers, the historic numbers, team leader numbers for the Mets franchise.
And Steve Cohen, the owner of the Mets, has done a terrific job, in my opinion, and I think Gordon's too, in bringing former Mets back into the organization, making them feel welcome, and building that sort of history that the Mets, we used to joke the Mets Hall of Fame, I would say, at Citi Field is more like a corridor of fame because it's really not that big.
Right.
And so bringing these people back in the organization. How about you? Do you have a relationship with the team at all? And have they talked about honoring the 2000 team? And tell me if anything's gone on there.
Yeah, so I've met Steve Cohen, and many of the people that I worked with are still in some capacity there. I don't know, I think that I think there's some plan to do something to honor the 2000 team. I think they did something for the 99 team as well last year, and so I suspect they'll do something. But look, I'm with you. I think Steve Cohen is fantastic. I think that he's got the right perspective of doing things. He effectively has become the George Steinbrenner in New York right now. The reality is the Mets have become the Yankees. Now, the Yankees haven't become the Mets. Hell, Steinbrenner, he lost out offering $760 million. Right. So there's no shame in that. But for Steve Cohen, there's always going to be one more dollar with his face on it than any other team and any other owner. And he loves the team. I was on the field for the Al Leiter Hall of Fame in number last year, and so I was certainly glad to be part of that, and hope to be part of some things in the future because I've got still a fond place for the Mets. A lot of times people get let go and they get bitter about it. I don't. My goodness, I had a great run there. I spent 20 years of my life, 7 years as a player, 13 in the front office as a member of the Mets, and I do wish them well. I will say that I don't root for any one team. I just root to be right. So whenever I make a prediction, I just root for that to be right. I don't really care who it is. So I root for the teams that I said would win just so that I could look like I knew what I was talking about.
I think you were rooting, you said you're rooting that the Soto acquisition for the Mets is just a little less than the Piazza acquisition, in the long run. So.
How dare they quadruple that? Yeah, crazy.
And we've gotten through a whole podcast, and I want you to know, I joked when we put out some information about the podcast that, the hardest thing will be not asking you about Bobby Bonilla, which we're not going to do at this point because we think it's tired, and the narrative. And you could always talk about Vinny Castilla. You want to talk about a guy who's still getting paid and nobody talks about.
Well, I have to say that listen, I am the godfather of deferred compensation. And so the Dodgers and their fans should be thanking me for what they're doing right now. Of course, what I did was sort of the junior varsity, and what they're doing is the varsity right now. But yeah, I consider myself the godfather of deferred compensation, so I never mind talking about it.
And Speaking of varsity, I just did have a question, just curiously, because I actually ended up playing not on the same team, but for the same varsity high school baseball program as your son. And I was just curious, as somebody that was involved in baseball, you were a professional baseball guy at the time. What was it like? I can't imagine how weird it was, like showing up. Is it hard to switch into dad mode and just watch your kid play the game? Like, I could never imagine what that was like for somebody that was like
Yeah,
that.
I always had great respect for coaches because everybody gets on the coach. I mean, my first experience at a football game in our town that we grew up in Wilton was somebody in the stands yelling, "Run the other play," which means that you only have two and you're stuck on running one. And I'm like, man, like I'm there. My kids aren't even in high school. I'm like, this is a rough crowd right here. And so I always sort of looked at it that my hope was that my kids, my boys, and anybody else would learn from each sport the real things that each sport can teach you. And so for football, it's that when it hurts, you can always push a little bit more. When it's tough, you can get up. When it's late in the game, you can keep on fighting. And for baseball, it's how do you deal with failure? How do you deal with failing 7 out of 10 times and be able to keep your focus, be able to bounce back, to keep your head up? You know, how if you make an error, how do you keep your head up in the game? And so, you know, in basketball, it's the idea of how each play interacts with each other, and defense and offense combined. So I just wanted them to learn the attributes that could come from it. And, you know, the result itself, I would want them to win. And I would tell you, I cried more watching my boys play sports over the years than I ever did watching the Mets play sports over the years. I did. It's far more emotional for a father than it is watching your team, even in professional sports. It's just because all you want is for them to succeed. And when they don't, you know what they're feeling because you felt it at one point yourself.
Well, Steve, just want to say thank you again for joining us. So, like I said, we'll keep talking. If you'll join us another time, we have a whole bunch of stuff we didn't even get to. And then some of it was talking about the 99 team and Piazza, and we talked a little bit about that. But you can catch Steve, and I don't know what else you do, because I don't know if you're still working for TNS on a regular basis, calling games up in Toronto. So if you are, you're doing that. You're on the morning, the leadoff spot every morning on Sirius. So there's just a lot of baseball in your life, and you come to it all with a great attitude and make it fun and enjoyable, because I think you enjoy it, and by extension we enjoy it because you show that you do so much. So thank you for that.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for having me. Really did appreciate it. A lot of fun.
Okay,
Thank you
thanks,
so
Steve.
much.